Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be with you today, although I regret I cannot be there physically. Congratulations for taking the initiative on this discussion. It's really tremendously important. In fact, childhood obesity is increasing in many European countries. We estimate that about 25%, depending of course on the country, of children, school-aged children, are already overweight or obese in Europe, and it's really not going down. And the tendency is really for an increase in many parts of the region, as I said before. Of course, obesity is the result of too many calories, low levels of physical activity, but diet is playing a very important role, and diet is shaped by very many things: culture, availability, environment, and one of the elements that we know today is very important in terms of shaping our children's diet is, of course, marketing. And the marketing of certain types of products that normally tend to be products with too much sugar, too much salt, too much fat, trans fats, and so on, is having an influence. So we are now far from the situation where some people were challenging the effect and the impact of marketing on children's behavior. We know that there is a connection between marketing and consumption, dietary habits, and between marketing and childhood obesity. Therefore, if you want to tackle childhood obesity, you really need to tackle the issues of marketing of foods high in fat and sugar and salt to children. Of course, the discussions today where you will be looking at these directives are very important because they are going to have obviously an impact on marketing and marketing that is in a way undesirable to children. One of the things we would like to call your attention and really to suggest is that you discuss the definitions of marketing and you look at marketing in a broader perspective, like marketeers do. So marketing is it's not just the simple, let's say, advertising of foods on TV or other channels, but it's also about price and place and promotion and sponsorship. So really it is very important that we have that comprehensive approach of marketing, following basically what the big gurus of marketing and the marketeers actually suggest. That's very important, and for us, from what we have seen, we believe that we could be a little bit more clear in that context. Another important element for your discussions on the views of WHO, we need to define a child for the purposes of marketing. Many of the self-regulatory approaches and initiatives, particularly by the food industry, notably the EU pledge, they use certain age thresholds, which in our view are not sufficient. So using the age of 12, it's very limited. We think it's still very important that both older children and adolescents are also included in the definition. So in what we use in terms of defining marketing of foods to children and young people. So there we clearly suggest that we have a child rights approach and that we follow the WHO policy frameworks in terms of defining children. Therefore, probably expanding the age threshold is very important from 12, ideally to 18 years old. So I would strongly recommend that you consider this 12-year-old, which is used by the food industry, as tremendously insufficient and bringing a lot of loopholes and gaps in the legislation. We also need to define what a child audience is. For many of the self-regulatory approaches we have in Europe, one could consider, for example, a child audience when you have at least 35% of children watching those, let's say, watching, TV or other means that time of the day, and for those programs. But we do have, programs which are not, aiming at children, where certainly a lot of children are watching. And in some cases, maybe it's targeting adults, but there's a lot of children in the audience. So it's kind of interesting situation where sometimes in absolute terms you have more children watching certain programs where you will have advertising to children, but the audience does not reach 35%. But in absolute terms, you may have more children. So we really need to define very well what a child audience is, and we strongly advise that you really look at that, and you would consider that the approach we have now in the context of the pledges has been shown to be, again, very, very insufficient. Another thing is that the suggestion goes very much in the area of self-regulatory approaches, those which is okay, of course, but we really need to also look at the provisions of this document and the proposal in terms of what we are doing about alcohol and tobacco. And we would like to suggest, because we shouldn't have basically advertising of foods with too much sugar, too much salt, and too much fat for children. Therefore, we shouldn't distinguish them so much. So kind of foods are being treated in a slightly different way, which is fine, but it should be, in a way, it should be closer. And we think that, clearly a more statutory kind of approach would eventually be desirable. Then we also, and this is one of my strongest points, we really need to define very well what let's say, in this context, what we consider unhealthy foods. What is actually a food which is high in fat, sugar, and salt, and trans fats? Well, we have a way to define that, and the best way in Europe is to use the WHO nutrient profiling model. So we would like to recommend and advise, like many NGOs and member states are considering, to use the WHO model, which was precisely, specifically developed to help member states regulating or tackling the issues of marketing of food to children. So by using this nutrient profile model, we can actually define what's acceptable and not acceptable in this context. So again, a suggestion, particularly strong as well in terms of using the WHO nutrient profile model, which is highly scientific and widely accepted, particularly in the scientific community, and when compared to other models is doing a much better job. We also think that eventually we should include online video platforms like YouTube, for example, in the context of this regulation. It's very important. This is where many of the children are going and watching and being exposed to marketing, and in fact they're using themselves as, they're being used as marketeers. So in the digital world, and marketing in the digital world is actually using children as elements and as active marketeers by trying to create incentives for them to share the videos or to do this or that on the online world. We are actually in a completely different dimension. So we are very worried with the issues of digital marketing. We've recently issued a report which tries to tackle the issue and suggest actions for member states eventually, and particularly identifies many of the challenges we have ahead of us in this context. We also think it's very important to, as I said, to look at total exposure of marketing. So we think that keeping an hour limit, which shouldn't be lower than 20%, is the best solution by looking at the present document. And of course, keep a definition of marketing which is comprehensive and broad enough. Having said this, I would like to express again our gratitude for this opportunity. I would like to convey our wishes for our best wishes for your meeting. We expect that you come up with suggestions and recommendations which are then taken into consideration. And of course, lastly, we would like to express WHO's willingness and openness to continue to these discussions and to work with you in the near future. Thanks very much.